Hello, everyone. Architectures of Order is a dialectical exploration of how societies construct order, manage power, and balance the tension between authoritarian control, market forces, and human freedom through the lens of intentional design. We synthesize political philosophy, institutional economics, and the ethics of design to comprehensively examine the very structural foundations of human coexistence. Design here must not be understood as a superficial or aesthetic discipline, but rather as the core, calculating mechanism used to manage crowds and mathematically construct our sociopolitical reality. By investigating these intentional frameworks, we trace a rigorous intellectual path from the absolute, suffocating grip of the Leviathan to the modern, intricate architecture of real world game theory. Every social structure, whether a totalitarian regime enforcing rigid compliance or a purportedly free market navigating supply and demand, operates on fundamental assumptions about human nature and leverages intentional design to maintain stability, mitigate conflict, and prevent the collapse of civilization. We will systematically dissect these specific architectural choices and the profound philosophical implications they carry for human agency, proving that our physical and institutional environments are deliberately engineered manifestations of theoretical power dynamics. Now, consider the foundational justification for the state as conceptualized by Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes articulates the brutal baseline of the state of nature, diagnosing human life without governance as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In this state of absolute liberty, the natural condition is characterized not by harmony, but by a perpetual, exhausting war of all against all. Hobbes posits that the inception of the state does not derive from moral elevation, divine mandate, or an inherent desire for justice, but solely from the desperate, biological necessity of escaping this chaotic violence. To ensure physical survival, individuals are forced to engage in the Leviathan trade off, a structural exchange where absolute liberty is completely surrendered for absolute submission. The Leviathan embodies concentrated power, a monolithic architecture of order explicitly designed to enforce peace through overwhelming top down authority. We surrender our natural rights to a sovereign not out of civic virtue, but out of a primal mechanical drive to avoid violent death. This establishes the ultimate authoritarian control paradigm, where institutional design serves the singular purpose of eradicating the existential threat posed by unregulated human nature. Shifting the paradigm entirely, Jean-Jacques Rousseau introduces the paradox of collective liberty, famously observing that man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. Instead of enforcing submission to a singular monarch, Rousseau proposes the architectural mechanism known as the feedback loop of the general will. Within this framework, individuals engage in the voluntary surrender of their absolute natural rights, but power is not relinquished to an external autocrat. Instead, it is surrendered entirely to the collective self. The general will operates as a structural design that rigorously prioritizes the greater public good over selfish individual desires. But here is the catch. This architecture involves the highly controversial concept of being forced to be free. Forcing a dissenting citizen to obey the general will is paradoxically returning them to their true freedom, as their dissent is viewed merely as a corruption of their authentic nature. It is a system where power is mutual and generated from within, designing society as an interconnected feedback loop where individual liberty is actualized only through absolute civic participation and total alignment with a collective apparatus. Let us contrast these diagnostic baselines directly to understand how theory dictates reality. Thomas Hobbes operates on the baseline assumption that man is inherently savage and self interested, identifying the primary societal threat as the relentless war of all against all. His architectural solution demands that power must be absolute, concentrated, and imposed from above by the Leviathan to maintain structural integrity. Conversely, Jean-Jacques Rousseau assumes man is born free but corrupted by unequal society, seeing the core threat as exploitation and the profound loss of authentic freedom. Rousseau's solution dictates that power must be collective, mutual, and generated from within as the general will to prevent societal decay. These two opposing views of human nature permanently dictate the architectural shape of the governments they inspire. One designs a vertical fortress of top down domination to suppress inherent savagery, while the other engineers a horizontal participatory circle to reclaim lost natural equality. This proves exactly how foundational philosophical assumptions fundamentally map the physical and legal blueprint of societal control. Moving from the theoretical origins of the state to the modern economic dilemma, we confront the boundaries of public administration. The architecture of order today requires determining the precise boundary where the state must intervene to correct a market failure without accidentally triggering a worse government failure. The market domain operates on decentralized pricing, perfect competition, and voluntary exchange, striving toward the theoretical efficiency of the first theorem of welfare economics. However, this domain inevitably suffers severe market failures, as imperfect competition and monopolies inevitably distort reality. On the opposing side, the state domain provides necessary public goods, enforces property rights, and guarantees defense and security through public administration. The conflict zone arises precisely where these institutional domains clash. Here, bureaucratic inefficiency and regulatory capture on the state side collide directly with the structural failures of the market. Designing this boundary requires rigorous analysis of economic trade offs, pinpointing exactly where state power should override market forces to optimize societal functioning without suffocating it. Consider a highly specific case study in contract theory: the privatization of prisons. Outsourcing the Leviathan's core duty of violence exposes the profound systemic risks of applying market logic to absolute state administration. Incomplete contracts reveal a critical structural flaw when services are non standardized and information is highly asymmetric. Under these conditions, the market organically and ruthlessly drives for cost cutting and profit optimization. Yet, when optimizing solely for profit in a prison environment, this mathematical drive occurs at the direct expense of human dignity. The architecture inevitably hits a threshold of ethical failure, leading to plummeting human rights and a total collapse of rehabilitation efforts. The complex, unmeasurable quality of rehabilitation is sacrificed entirely because it cannot be neatly codified or measured in a profit driven contract. This proves that outsourcing incarceration crosses a fundamental institutional boundary, demonstrating that certain sovereign duties cannot be commodified without structurally destroying the ethical order they were ostensibly meant to uphold. Diving deeply into the moral foundations of action, we examine two competing, mutually exclusive architectures of morality: duty versus utility. Immanuel Kant constructs the categorical imperative, establishing a rigid structural rule to act only according to that maxim, whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. Kantian focus rests entirely on intent, universalizability, and the absolute, unyielding mandate that humans are ends never means. In stark contrast, Jeremy Bentham engineers utilitarianism operating on the mechanics of the greatest happiness principle. Benthamite morality is a mathematical equation maximizing pleasure for the greatest number, focusing exclusively on outcomes and the cold calculus of the crowd. While the macro structure of the state requires utility to govern the masses effectively, the microstructure of the individual requires Kantian duty to maintain intrinsic human dignity. These dual mechanics continuously dictate how policies are designed, oscillating between the calculation of aggregate happiness and the unbreakable structural integrity of universal human rights. To surgically test the structural limits of utilitarianism, Robert Nozick proposes the experience machine. Nozick's critique directly targets the core Benthamite assumption that morality is merely maximizing happiness. If we were to plug into this hypothetical machine, the outcome would be infinite simulated pleasure but zero human agency. If we choose to stay out, the outcome is variable suffering coupled inextricably with authentic human dignity. If utility is the ultimate architectural goal of society, plugging into a perfect simulation would mathematically be the highest moral good. The visceral human refusal to do so definitively proves that truth and authentic agency possess an intrinsic structural value that utilitarian calculus simply cannot measure or accommodate. This thought experiment dismantles the idea that a perfectly designed hedonistic reality is sufficient for human flourishing. We inherently demand actual friction with the world, proving that the architecture of human existence requires authentic navigation of reality, not just the passive reception of synthesized joy. This brings us to the Robert Grudin paradigm, which explicitly positions design as applied philosophy. Design is not merely aesthetic ornamentation, it is the physical language of intention. Grudin posits that a well-designed tool systematically honors the user's intellect and extends human senses, bridging the gap between intention and action. Good design actively reveals truth, empowers the user, and fosters autonomy, acting as a physical, undeniable manifestation of ethical philosophy. Bad design, conversely, lies, manipulates, and aligns structurally with the abuse of power. It is completely synonymous with authoritarian manipulation, masking its true function behind deceitful interfaces. When we interact with a built environment, we are not interacting with neutral objects, but with codified philosophical intent. The physical structures we use daily either elevate our agency by making the world's underlying mechanics transparent, or they subjugate us through deliberate obfuscation, fundamentally proving that design is an ongoing moral act. Examine spatial egalitarianism through the lens of Senno Rikyu's quiet rebellion in the design of the Japanese tea ceremony. Rikyu utilized meticulous spatial design as a direct structural countermeasure against Toyotomi Hideyoshi's authoritarian rule. Hideyoshi heavily favored monumental, overwhelming fascist architecture expressly designed to dwarf the individual into submission and continuously reinforce absolute hierarchy. Rikyu, however, masterfully engineered the Nijiji-guchi, or crawling entrance, to his minimalist tea room. This specific physical, structural constraint forces the powerful samurai to leave their long swords outside and bow deeply to enter, physically stripping them of their status and creating an egalitarian micro-society within the walls of the room. This minimalist, organic design fundamentally threatened the rigid hierarchy of Japan's most powerful autocrat. By dictating bodily posture and physically removing symbols of violence, Rikyu's architecture proved that the intentional design of a microscopic space could successfully subvert macro-political dominance. Similarly, we observe the deliberate construction of civic architecture through Thomas Jefferson's practice of self-design. Jefferson applied rigorous humanist design principles equally to documents of state, his own personal life, and the physical layouts of university campuses. Consciously rejecting imposing hierarchical Gothic verticality, he utilized open, horizontal, and interconnected pavilions to physically map the egalitarian ideology of a new republic. The architecture meticulously reflects core philosophical pillars. Rationality yields freedom from tyranny, civic equality directly supports liberty, and human dignity arises intrinsically from reason and nature's God. Jefferson conclusively proved that democratic freedom requires an architecture built on reason rather than awe. By structuring physical spaces that promote horizontal democratic discourse rather than vertical authoritarian subjugation, the built environment functions as a pedagogical tool, continuously reinforcing the Enlightenment logic required for free citizens to actively maintain an architecture of liberty. When massive organizational power entirely divorces itself from truth, we encounter the Edsel hypothesis and the mechanics of the bureaucratic blind spot funnel. In this structural failure, corporate hubris, massive resources, and top-down priorities are forced through a rigid institutional funnel, completely obscuring and discarding actual user needs. When design, intentionally or structurally ignores the user, it inevitably produces over-designed catastrophes like the Ford Edsel. This phenomenon represents the precise corporate equivalent of an authoritarian state dictating reality from the top down. The failure of the Edsel is not merely a superficial miscalculation of aesthetics, it is a profound structural failure of information processing. The bureaucratic blind spot funnel intercepts empirical truth from the ground up, replacing physical reality with the isolated, unchallenged assumptions of powerful architects. Consequently, disastrous design emerges inevitably when an asymmetrical power dynamic totally insulates decision makers from the fundamental requirement of user-centric truth. At the absolute extreme of this control spectrum is the dark design of totalitarianism, heavily implicated in the philosophy of Martin Heidegger. Totalitarianism does not just legally silence dissent, it structurally designs a comprehensive environment that makes it physically and mentally impossible to perceive alternatives. Heidegger's Nazism illustrates precisely how deep philosophical concepts like Dasein and destiny were darkly designed and manipulated to justify the elimination of the inauthentic and serve the violent goals of a fascist state. Dark design weaponizes these theoretical concepts to forge a tangible architecture of oppression, creating a monolithic reality where both physical space and intellectual thought are entirely subjugated to the state's narrative. This architectural strategy seeks to permanently eradicate individual agency by ensuring that the built environment and the intellectual framework offer absolutely no exit, engineering an inescapable void where authoritarian reality is the only perceivable truth. To understand the historical progression out of such systemic oppression, we must rigorously analyze G. W. F. Hegel's master-slave dialectic. Hegel mathematically asserts that history is not static. It progresses forcefully through the dialectical clash of inherently opposing forces. In this mechanism, we have the master, representing dominance but ultimately doomed to stagnation, and the slave, who actively engages in labor and the physical transformation of nature. The true engine of human progression is the intense, unavoidable struggle for recognition between these locked entities. True freedom is not an isolated, passive state, but a hard-won synthesis achieved exclusively through mutual recognition and the development of self-awareness. The slave, by interacting with and designing the material world through applied labor, achieves a higher consciousness. This dialectic reveals that the structural design of society is constantly driven forward by the inevitable conflict generated by unequal power dynamics seeking synthesis and ultimate resolution. Transforming this Hegelian dialectic, Karl Marx structurally engineers the materialist engine. Marx systematically stripped away Hegel's abstract philosophical concept of spirit and aggressively replaced it with raw historical materialism. The true engine driving the design of human society is no longer abstract self-awareness, but the perpetual physical conflict over economic resources and labor. In this specific blueprint, the bourgeoisie controls capital, and the proletariat provides labor. The pistons of this historical engine are driven by relentless class struggle, the fierce, continuous friction between these two fundamental economic forces. This proletarian drive serves as the exact mechanism propelling society toward a specific design destination, a communist utopia. Marx's architectural view dictates that all societal structures, laws, governments, and cultures are entirely designed by the underlying economic foundation, making intentional class conflict the supreme tool for redesigning material reality. Directly countering both rational philosophical progress and materialist determinism, Arthur Schopenhauer introduces a deeply pessimistic counter-narrative, the blind will. Schopenhauer definitively argues that the universe is not driven by rational progress, dialectical improvement, or any form of divine design. Instead, reality is propelled exclusively by a blind, directionless, meaningless, and insatiable will that permeates all nature and human endeavor. Within this chaotic vector field, there is no ultimate historical utopia. The desperate search for one is exposed as a tragic illusion. Schopenhauer's mechanism of history is nothing but irrational, directionless, biological striving. This perspective utterly demolishes the idea of an intentional progressive architecture of order, suggesting instead that all human designs, governments, and philosophies are merely temporary, futile constructs attempting to mask the terrifying underlying chaos of an existence completely devoid of ultimate destination or meaning. Let us systematically and analytically compare these macro-historical drivers. Understanding a society's overarching design requires knowing exactly which of these historical engines its architects believed they were serving. For Hegel, the driver is abstract spirit, utilizing the mechanism of the master-slave dialectic to inevitably reach the destination of absolute self-awareness and freedom. For Marx, the driver is historical materialism, utilizing class struggle and the proletarian drive to arrive mathematically at a communist utopia. For Schopenhauer, the driver is the blind will, operating purely through irrational biological striving, leading to a bleak destination of absolute none or meaninglessness. These fundamental philosophical pillars govern the structural design of civilization. If architects believe in Marx, they design for conflict and economic restructuring. If they follow Hegel, they design for the synthesis of recognition. If they align with Schopenhauer, any imposed design is merely a fragile, temporary shield against the inevitable chaos. We now stand precariously between the absolute extremes of human organization, imposed order versus meaningless chaos. On one structural side, we have the Leviathan's authority and totalitarian design, representing absolute control, entirely suffocating human agency. On the opposite side, we have the state of nature and the blind will, representing absolute chaos, systematically destroying human survival. Humanity cannot biologically survive the brutal, unstructured chaos of the blind will, but it simultaneously loses its soul under the crushing, oppressive weight of the Leviathan. The architecture of order must confront this brutal dichotomy directly. Absolute freedom equates to violent self destruction, while absolute security requires the total surrender of authentic existence. The ultimate philosophical challenge for any society is navigating this perilous chasm. Where is the middle ground? How do we engineer a framework that protects biological survival without simultaneously constructing a prison that eradicates human dignity? The required middle ground is located precisely on a razor-thin fulcrum, ethical design acting as the ultimate balancing mechanism. True social and architectural order is neither absolute freedom nor absolute control. It is a highly intentional ethical design practice that positions itself directly between the crushing architecture of the Leviathan and the terrifying vortex of the blind will. This ethical, user-centric design system empowers individual knowledge, profoundly respects human limits, and actively avoids the hubris of totalitarian control. It requires deliberate, meticulous calibration to forge institutions that maintain societal order while simultaneously optimizing human agency. This fulcrum is where abstract philosophy becomes concrete reality, utilizing the specific structural tools of design to mathematically wedge open a sustainable space for human flourishing amidst extreme historical, political, and biological pressures. In navigating this complex ethics of order, we actively and structurally reject the failures of the extremes. We must vigilantly avoid the corporate hubris of the Edsel Blindspot, the unethical prioritization of cost in privatized prisons, the soulless utilitarian experience machine, and the systemic darkness of totalitarianism. Instead, we draw heavily upon Jeffersonian democracy, Rikyu's spatial egalitarianism, the social contract, and Kantian duty to construct a viable framework. We are the architects of our own reality. By systematically rejecting the extremes of both savage nature and absolute tyranny, we construct the intentional architecture of freedom. Good design is not merely aesthetic, it is the applied philosophy of human dignity. The built environment, economic structures, and the legal systems must be continuously and intentionally designed to honor the user's intellect and safeguard their moral autonomy against the ever encroaching forces of absolute control and chaotic entropy. Ultimately, the blueprint is never finished. As long as information is asymmetric and power is unequal, the design of society remains a fundamentally incomplete contract. We are forced to be free, and therefore we are forced to design. As we transition fully into the AI era, this imperative becomes exponentially more critical. When artificial intelligence systems begin to architect our economic and social realities, the threat of a digital Leviathan or an algorithmic blind whale emerges rapidly. The invisible, scalable power of AI demands a rigorous, ethically applied philosophy of design to prevent a new, subtle totalitarianism that suffocates human agency behind neural networks. We must actively design the parameters of artificial intelligence to ensure it serves as a tool for human dignity, empowering user autonomy rather than manipulating our reality. The task of intentional design remains our greatest defense and our heaviest burden. Thank you. See you next time.